This is the Balanced Growth Show with Dr. Travis Perry, helping successful business professionals like you achieve balance in their lives.
Welcome to another episode of the Balanced Growth Show. My name is Travis Perry. I'm your host as always, and today we have an excellent guest lined up for you. His name is Brody Vinson. Brody's a business owner, podcast host, and currently pursuing professional MBA. He's always wanted to be an entrepreneur, having grown up with one as a father. However, after losing his father in 2021 to an unexpected accident, it was a life-changing event for him, and he had to sell his business. At the same time, he was running a startup with partners that just had taken off and would go on to do $3.2 million in revenue over its first 2 years in action. He exited that company through a successful acquisition, and now he consults with business owners on how to prepare for a successful exit. And I'm so glad to have him on the show. Brody, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Perry. I really appreciate being here.
Absolutely. I think this is great timing as we were talking about this idea of how to prepare for an exit. You know, there may be exit planning. There may be some strategies that financial planners do, which I'm very well aware of. And a lot of financial planners are interested in this topic as they have clients in this situation. But preparing for one is definitely on the minds of so many. They're just not doing a whole lot about it. So we're going to dive into this, and we're going to dive into your story first, though. Tell us, how did you get to this point? Tell us a little bit about, how, your father's untimely death, and, our condolences your way, how that has helped shape you, though, as an individual.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of context to get started out. At the time of my father's passing, I was working full-time. I was working in digital marketing for essentially a company where I consulted with about 50 to 80, depending on the time, Marriott hotels around the country and some internationally on paid media and content and a bunch of other things. So that's where I was at the time. Aside from that, that was a remote position. So I did a lot of freelance work. And so I talked to a lot of small business owners about all types of things. And that's how I became involved with who would later become my partners in the staffing company that I exited earlier this year. So beginning of 2021, I was getting started with them. It was just an idea at that point. Flash forward to about 9 months later, it's September of 2021. And right at the same time that the staffing company was really taking off, my father had a motorcycle accident, and I ended up losing him about a month later. So we had our first big contract with the staffing company. For a little more context, it was basically a staffing company for chefs and cooks. So we did a lot of corporate gigs. Our first one was at the University of Chicago and Northwestern up there in Chicago. And so we were staffing about 60 people at the peak of that, just all of a sudden hitting the ground running while I was going through this. And so I had to learn to live in a lot different way very quickly. And it's interesting. Your show is about balance. We're going to talk about that here. I went through a time of an extreme imbalance to get to where I'm at right now through that period, just as the cards fell, so to speak. And so I went through that. Luckily, I had some great partners to help me through it and to handle some of the things that were going on. And at the same time, having lost my father, he had a business that he'd been building for about 20 years, as a custom men's clothing business. So suits, shirts, pants, that type of thing. And the thing that I learned very quickly is that business suffered from something called the key man factor. May or may not be familiar with that. What that basically means is that the business relies very heavily on the owner and the founder. And so having lost my father, the business just started to kind of gradually lose value, because having been left with my sister and I, number one, we weren't him. We didn't know the business like he did. And number two, we both had a lot going on our own. I had the other company taking off and lots of other things going on. So that business started to just gradually lose some value. Eventually, we sold it to one of the employees in the business and were able to hand it off successfully. But it sold for a lot less than what it should have been worth because of a lot of that. And so that was my first kind of big lesson in how a business needs to be built to sell. There's kind of an epidemic in the small business world right now, Dr. Perry, and it's essentially that most small business owners have created for themselves a very demanding and sometimes low paying and very taxing job for themselves and not really a business. And so there's a lot that goes into creating a business and not just a job for yourself. So I began to kind of learn those lessons through that first experience and was able to take a lot of that and implement it into the staffing company. And very quickly, we just through what we were doing, we were able to do about 3.2 million in revenue over our first 2 years. And I exited that company earlier this year after it was acquired by a larger staffing company.
Wow.
The reason I was able to do that is because of some of the things that I think we're going to get into today. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of how that went. I think there's a lot to be learned from that. But I'd say the biggest thing and the most common denominator I like to say is that to be able to sell a business and to be able to exit, this might seem intuitive, but it's not as obvious or as easy as it sounds. You have to make yourself removable. And so the more caught up in the day-to-day you are, the less sellable your business is. And I say that this is an epidemic for really three main reasons. The first reason is this takes a really heavy toll on the owner themselves, mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually, you name it. It's just really hard on the owner being caught up and stuck in the business in that way and doing everything, wearing every hat that there is. It also takes a heavy toll on the other people involved in the business, the owner's family and friends, the employees of the business, and even the customers of the business a lot of times suffer from the owner's inability to kind of remove themselves. And the third reason is it's just really wasteful because businesses that are not built to have a removable owner don't really create wealth for the people around them. For the owner, the family, the employees involved. And so creating a business that's meant to be sold, I really feel is the ethical choice. It's the best thing for all involved. And so that's why it's my mission to be able to empower business owners to build a business in that way with the exit in mind and to be able to structure it in a way that works out best for everyone.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the intro. And as we were talking about your father, you mentioned that there was an extreme imbalance in your life at that time after you lost him. I think a lot of times we think balance is this equilibrium and somehow, everything's going to be okay. But likely, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but likely the imbalance that was happening is that perceived imbalance of not, having some kind of equilibrium, that you were focusing on what was most important in your life, probably taking care of all of those things that your dad needed to. Now, we have a very eerily similar situation that you and I spoke of, pre-show about my father passing away. I was 26. How old were you when your father died?
24.
24. So we both have had this incredible life-changing event very young in our professional careers. And quite honestly, neither of us had expected our fathers to not be here the rest of our, adult lives most of the way through. So this is something that has absolutely changed us. In addition, you talk about key man factor. My dad was the key man of his business. Now he has brothers who were in the business at the time, but his father had retired and my dad was really running the company. So when he left, he not only left a hole for everyone else to fill, but there was no planning for it. None at all. So this really has bugged me and irked me for a long time. And, this is super, super important that we take a look at our businesses. And we're going to talk about these details here in a minute, but just the importance of this episode is so crucial to understand as we're building with the idea of exiting, with the idea of being able to sell or leave it to the next generation, which would have been me and my brothers, and what could happen if it does not go as planned. So this is a setup that we're going to get into more details here in a second, but let's talk about, why it's important for you to have balance while you're growing the business. And we're going to talk about exiting, but as you're growing businesses, is balance overrated? Meaning, not the equilibrium, but focusing on what's important so you don't lose your health, your relationship, your spirituality. Let's talk about those top three. Why is it important to have your health, your relationship, your spirituality while you're growing your business?
Well, I think it all comes down to consistency at the end of the day. I'll share some pretty shocking statistics with you about small businesses, and I'll kind of tie it in back to your question. But about 20% of small businesses fail within the first year. By the second year, it's 30. By the fifth year, it's about half. And by the end of a decade, really only about 30% of small businesses remain. And I think the reason for that is that you start out in a form and fashion that you can't maintain over that decade. And so balance to me is finding something that you can do every day. You can show up every day, every week, every month, every year, and build on that and not burn yourself out, not cause the business to crumble, and just find a way to build on it slowly and steadily in a way that allows you to maintain that and continue growing on it. So I think that's different for every person. I think it takes a lot of really deep introspection to be able to understand that for yourself. It takes a lot of humility and detachment from ego to understand what it is that you need to be able to have that consistency. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners are very driven, ambitious people that get ahead of themselves very often. So it takes a lot of objectivity, and that's not easy to do. You have to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations with yourself, with others, to really figure out what's going on and how to best manage that and find that balance. And I think that, back to your question, you mentioned family, health, other things, finding balance in that. It all goes back into what can keep you consistent. If you're not showing up in the gym, if you're not eating healthy, you're not taking care of yourself, you might get sick and you might fall off for a week, a month, and the business might suffer, might even fail because of it. If you're not taking care of your relationship, if you're married or just in a serious relationship, you might fall off of the business because of relational troubles that you're not addressing. So addressing everything that you need personally and understanding that very clearly and holistically is absolutely essential to have that consistency over time, which is the number one thing that it takes to grow a business.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, you're so driven, passionate about your business. I've had people who, they come to me a lot. Well, Travis, I work 75 hours a week, but it's not work. Like, what do you mean it's not work? Well, I love what I do. I'm like, well, that's fine. It's still work. Like, you have to classify it as something. If it's a hobby, you're doing it for fun and, maybe you don't need the money. Regardless, it's still work. You have to classify it somewhere. And what I typically find is people who are this driven, they can get out of balance quickly because their health, their relationships, as you mentioned. Yet we've interviewed over 1,000 now, and most will say their most important priorities in life are their family and their health. Yet those are the two things that usually get the backseat. So I love that you mentioned this earlier, like, make yourself removable. If you're removable, then you do have a business. If you're not removable, you have a practice. You have something that you're strapped to. You have something that you're constantly having to be there for. And that is it's a dangerous place to be in. Obviously, we're going to talk about, building and growing over time, and that doesn't just happen overnight. But I think you and I both would say systems, right? Focus on systems. How does one, and let's dive into this just a little bit, to have greater balance, what do you suggest to better make yourself removable?
Well, I think a lot of business owners, myself included, this is a place I've been and a place I'm always trying to move away from, struggle to create space for the things that they need to create space for. And that has to be very intentional. I personally made a decision not too long ago to really live and die by my calendar. That was monumental for me. I block off time to do the things that I know that I need. For example, after I get off of this podcast, I'll be meeting with my personal trainer and training for an hour. And I used to be very consistent in the gym back in college and afterwards before I was a business owner. It just wasn't something I struggled with. But as I found something I loved and was working on my business, I felt that start suffering. So I decided to make that a priority by building in accountability. I think building in intentionality and accountability is really important. So that's a personal example for me. Another personal example is I see a therapist every 2 weeks. That's something that lives on my calendar. It's blocked off. It's something I know is going to happen. And that creates time for me to really be honest with myself and find objectivity, make hard decisions, and examine the things that are going on in my life and make sure that I can have the sustainability that I know that I need to have. So I think it's about really just literally blocking off that time for yourself to accomplish the things that you need to accomplish. But it starts with understanding how often those things need to be addressed. And that takes a little bit of trial and error. I think creating systems is huge, and that starts with documentation. So the things that you do in your business really all come down to systems and processes. And so what I like to coach business owners to do is to look at those things objectively and just say, what are the things that I'm doing on a regular basis, and how might I create a standard operating procedure for that? That's one of the big things I focus on. Is there are things that you do consistently in your business, and without creating a standard operating procedure for them, you're not only going to not be able to deliver them and perform them consistently, but you also won't be able to teach them to others. And ultimately, to make yourself removable, you need other people. So to be able to train others and put others in place to do what you do, it takes those systems and standard operating procedures.
Well, yeah, systems are crucial. I talk about them all the time on the show in my training and coaching. If you don't have a system, it's like not having a plan. And what they say about planning, right? If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And it's just the truth, because we live in a society full of distraction, not being able to stay present. It's the constant squirrel or the constant shiny object syndrome, whatever you want to call it. But living by your calendar, having standard operating procedures for your business, but also systems for your personal. This is I found to be crucial. And I think that's part of your calendar, sticking by that, seeing a therapist, doing those things that you know will continually allow you to show up best in your life. So important. Well, let's talk about how you've been able to scale and grow. You have a fantastic story. You've been able to turn around some companies, build them and exit them, and now help others to do the same. So let's talk about, as you've been trying to keep this balance and work on your health and your relationships and well-being. How have you actually scaled these businesses? What have you done on the marketing, on the growth side to make such an impact?
The best example I can give is the company that I exited earlier this year, and I'll share a little bit about how scaling looked for us. At the beginning, with our first contract, going back to the systems, we didn't have systems. So for us, it was finding the technology that we needed, understanding the need that we had. We had to find payment processors that worked for us, that were customized to our industry. We live in a world full of technology now, and you should not only be using technology that accomplishes the needs that you have, but I think you should also be using technology that's customized to the type of industry that you operate in. It's just, there's no use in trying to figure things out for yourself when others have really put a lot of time into building technology like that out. So I think it just starts with doing research on what type of technologies are out there. For us, we were able to find a system that handled, so we were in staffing, we were able to find a system that handled payroll processing, invoicing, and a few other things, and also served as a CRM system for all of our clients and as well as the people that we were staffing. and an HR system as well. And that was something very customized to the staffing industry. And that was a complete night and day difference for us, putting a system like that in place. It costed a little bit of money to maintain, but ultimately we made much more money because it allowed for scale. And you don't really get scale without systems and processes, because if you're a business owner, you're one person, you don't have any kind of leverage as one person. You could work every hour of every week and you would find that you could only get up to a certain point. So finding technology like that. The other thing that worked really well for us is early on, we were able to identify talent that we promoted. So on our very first contract ever, we had just a contractor that helped us out with some things and immediately showed some leadership qualities. So we promoted him to a manager of other contractors and employees first. And we just continued finding ways to allow him to grow. We had identified that not only did he have leadership qualities, but he wanted to grow further. And we tried to just stay ahead of the ball constantly in what he needed. So if you have employees, if you are a business owner with employees already, and you're not making time for regular conversations with them about what they want and what they need, they will go somewhere else eventually, because an employee wants not only fair compensation, and that's become increasingly competitive and will continue to become more increasingly competitive. They also want to be taken care of. They want to have a good relationship with you as the business owner, and they want to have their needs taken care of, and they want to be able to grow. So if you're not making the time for regular conversations where you're getting to know them and getting to know their needs, you won't know what those things are, and it looks different for everyone. So we identified that early on, and we just tried to build on that wherever we could. So talking specifically about this individual, we had identified the leadership, the want for growth. There were certain things that he was lacking at the time as far as security in his day-to-day and his life that we helped him find. We gave him some resources that he needed for success, and that paid itself back in droves, and it really paid dividends for both him and for us, just taking care of him and giving him what he needed to have to succeed. And he really helped us build out all types of systems. So for every single client that we managed, we had a very detailed folder with their contracts, their systems, the schedule for what was going on with them, a list of people that were working on the contract. And you have to have systems like that. So now in my current business, if I take on a new client, I have a very structured folder with a set of documents that is going to be pertinent for any client I deal with, that gets copied and customized to that client as soon as they come on board, because I know that for them to have the right type of experience and for me to be able to replicate that type of experience again and again and get better at it, there has to be a system behind it.
Man, gold nuggets right here being dropped. I heard you got to have people. You've got to have them as, your systems, and you got to rely on them. I talk probably every single time on the show about delegating and creating teams and the power of teams. And we could probably unpack a lot of this, but what I heard you say, the majority of this time is just kind of trust your people, put the right people in spots that you need them to work, and then trust them. So let me ask you, what is your secret to being able to trust these people with your baby? Because this is how a lot of business owners, quite honestly, look at their business. This is my baby. This is my thing. Yet they're not able to remove themselves, right? And they're so attached. What's been your secret to being able to do that?
I wouldn't say there's any magic bullet or secret. It takes a lot of work. It takes really being intentional about handing off that responsibility in a structured way. So if you know that you need an employee for something, you better have a really set, structured plan of action for them going into it. And you better understand it yourself. A lot of people hire just because they think that they need a position, and they go on, for example, decide that you need an HR manager, which is a position that we filled later down the road in our company. And you just go on Google and you type, what is the job description of an HR manager? That's completely irrelevant to your business. You
Right.
have to create your own job descriptions. You have to think about the actual things that you're doing. So I coach business owners often if they're thinking about making a hire or if they're thinking about finding some kind of technology to help offload some of what they're doing, to actually make a literal list of the daily and weekly activities that you're doing, devote time to it, block off an hour or two, and literally just make the most detailed list that you can possibly imagine. And that becomes your job description list, because if you put that in the actual job description and find someone based on that, then they're going to come in knowing exactly what needs to be done, and it's going to work out as long as you touch in with them and make sure that they're doing a good job. So it really all just comes down to intentionality. You have to outline that before you make that hire, and you have to know what you're hiring for. And then you have to check in with them regularly. I tell business owners to set a recurring call for employees. It's something that worked really well for me back when I was working my 9 to 5. I had an incredible manager and learned this very early. And she would have a weekly one-on-one call with me, even though we were on a team of 15. And every single week she was asking me, hey, how are things going? What are the main things you're dealing with? How can I help you do better? She would set goals with me. So setting goals with your employees, understanding what's working for them and what's not working for them, and solving for that. It's ultimately your job as a business owner and a CEO to solve problems. And I like to think in a situation like this, I like to think about what is the definition of learning from a mistake, because mistakes happen all the time in business, and it's what you do about them that actually makes the big difference. Learning from a mistake is seeing the mistake and changing your action the next time so that it doesn't happen again. So business owners let the same mistakes happen over and over again. Ultimately, you have to see it and correct for it. So documentation, systems, follow up, really just having good conversations with the people involved and addressing it objectively is what that really takes.
Yeah. So important. What is it that you do as the business owner? That's super important for you to know that. A lot of my clients are dealing with a lot of personal stuff. And we look at their personal systems only to find out they're being distracted by a lot of what's going on here or outside. The things that they're working so hard for become their distractions at work. And then when they're at work or at home, they're thinking about work, and you don't have these boundaries. Being able to put people in place to take care of the things that aren't as important for you to be doing personally allows you to do exactly that, to scale and to grow. What do you think are some of the major obstacles that you've come across as you're implementing systems and standard operating procedures for you personally?
For me personally, I guess just not creating the right systems and not really understanding the problem to begin with. I think there's a lot of misdiagnosing of problems. For example, if you have a lot of customer churn, or in other words, your customers drop off quickly, they don't stay with you for a long time, you might see that as a lot of business owners look at that and just misdiagnose that. They might think that it's an issue with the customer or something later down the road. They might think that they messed up in a particular meeting or did something wrong that week and that led to it. But it was probably more so that they failed to address expectations or onboard them correctly in the first place. So I think really figuring out where the actual problem is coming from before you make those systems. So a lot of people address a symptom of a problem without actually digging down to the root of it. And if you're creating systems around symptoms, you're not going to really actually solve the problem. So you need to create systems around the root of the problem. And that takes a lot of really deep, intentional looking and asking. And again, a lot of hard conversations. I think I made a social media clip about this recently. Actually, they say that the people that are most successful in life have some of the highest number of hard and uncomfortable conversations, and a lot of business owners shy away from conflict and hard conversations and end up running into issues later down the road because problems just become bigger.
Yeah, it's the truth. It's the truth. I appreciate you mentioning this and for giving us some of your wisdom here on the podcast. If people want to interact with you, they want to learn how to, be able to prepare to exit their company, work on their standard operating procedures, really create these systems in business that can help them to do that. How do they get a hold of you? What's the best way?
You can get a hold of me on pretty much any social media. I post a lot on Instagram and LinkedIn. Instagram, brodyvinson.io. LinkedIn is just Brody Vinson. You can find me on TikTok at brody.vinson, YouTube at Brody Vinson. I have a podcast myself called Profession Session that I do weekly interviews and post episodes of. And then you can find my business at scaleforsale.com.
Love it. I appreciate this, Brody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being such a great guest. If you want to leave, the listeners with one last piece of advice on, how to grow and scale while keeping your balance, what would you say?
Well, I wanted to leave you with one big thing, and I want you to just consider Apple, the company, for a second. Think about Steve Jobs. A lot of people very correctly attribute the success of Apple to Steve Jobs, and that's right and wrong because he had a lot to do with building the company and getting off the ground. But he's been gone for a while now, and Apple is the biggest company in the world and continues to grow. And that's because it was built to have a removable owner. So if you look at companies that have had success like that and track back to the things that created that, it all comes down to your mission, vision, and your values. I would encourage any business owner to start there. Start by really, really taking a look at your mission, vision, and values, writing them down, writing them out, and letting that guide you throughout the whole process, because there will be distractions. There will be shiny object syndrome. There will be ups and downs. And that's the thing that you can always fall back to and remind yourself of why you're there in the first place. And that'll allow you to create the kind of exit that you want to have if you always track back to that.
Thank you for your advice. Thanks for being here on the show. And I'm excited to see your growth. And as you continue to help others out there, please give Brody a shout out, follow him on social, and reach out to him. We'll have all those links in the show notes for this podcast. And until next time, remember to like, subscribe, share. Maybe there's somebody out there who needs to know about these things we're talking about, making yourself a removable, aspect of the business. I love this piece. I think that is my takeaway from today's show. Thanks again, Brody, for being here. But until next time, remember, everyone, live life on purpose.
Thanks so much, Dr. Perry. I look forward to seeing you grow as well. And I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.